Today, sermon title, The Road Untraveled. The Road Untraveled. And I'll get back to that title probably way towards the back of the sermon. So if I forget it, I don't think it's important for the sermon, but I'll try to remember to return to it. After Easter Sunday, I was thinking about this low Sunday after Easter. You know, it's normally a bit of an anticlimax after the long weeks of Lent, and then Palm Sunday, Holy Week, and then Easter Sunday. And I was reading passages about resurrection, looking for a passage to use as the basis of a sermon for the second Sunday of Easter. And one thing that struck me was how little there is actually written in our Gospels about the resurrection, seeing that it is probably the central narrative or moment for Christianity. But that's besides the point. And I read this passage that Charlie read for us, this one from Matthew chapter 28, the last few verses of the Gospel according to Matthew. And this is a passage that I think that has disproportionate influence on Christianity, and also on the world, for that matter. It played a very significant role in the missionary work of the church, and this was always seen as the order that Jesus gave, and say, this is what you should do. This should be the mission of the church, the reason for its existence. Go now, the resurrected Jesus, say, go and make disciples of everybody. Bring in the numbers, convert people. And it was especially seen as the justification for Christianity to regard itself as the superior one among the religions in the world, among humanity, and the justification to, at all costs and by all means, to convert people. And sometimes terrible things were done in that process in the name of the God of love. This is also, as the translators indicated with their heading here, known as the Great Commission, where the disciples are commissioned and told by Jesus, this is what you should be doing. And in Christianity, there are many different divisions or groups or points of view, a whole spectrum, no matter what axis you take. One of those main dividing lines is in the view that the Great Commission identifies what the church should be doing: making disciples, winning converts. That's the Great Commission. On the other side, you find people who say that's not the most important thing, to make converts, to bring in new adherents, especially from other religions, to win them over to the better one, to Christianity. No, they say, no, that's not important, that's the other side. Or a main motive in Christianity, say, no, it's about the great commandment, being a disciple by living the message of Jesus, living the kingdom. So you have this, these two main perspectives living still today in Christianity. I had an interesting insight working with this passage. And it was an aha moment for me in that post-Easter week. And I'll get back to that towards the end of the sermon, as I've said. But working with this passage, it also caused me to refer back to the full gospel of Matthew and to contemplate the importance of this passage in view of the central themes or main motives that we find in the gospel of Matthew. It is important, especially when we consider that we just lit a candle in remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust. I think it is important to look at the Gospel of Matthew and to realize or identify that of all the Gospels, Matthew is probably the most easily identified as coming from within Judaism. It is probably written by a Jewish author for a Jewish Christian community of the early church, of the Jesus movement, written towards the end of the first century after the birth of Jesus. And the author of Matthew goes to considerable length to illustrate that Jesus is indeed the Jewish Messiah, to establish Jesus' Jewish credentials. If you look at the birth stories, for instance, it goes back to Egypt and makes that connection to the origin or the movement, the Exodus movement, and so forth, back to Jerusalem, and he's born in Bethlehem, where King David was, etc., etc. We're familiar with that part of establishing Jewish credentials for Jesus. But in the gospel itself, we also find, when the author let Jesus speak, we find Jesus saying, this message is for the Jewish people. When he sends out his disciples in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says, don't go to the Samaritans or the Gentiles, go to the Jewish people, specifically Galilee. And later on in Matthew chapter 15, it tells them, go to the lost sheep of Israel. They are the important ones. And Jesus also says, I have not come to do away with the Jewish law, with the Torah and the prophets. No, I've come to give it its full meaning, and nothing of it should be removed. So there is an affirming of Judaism, an embracing of that, and even saying this message is primarily and in the first place for the Jewish people. But there's also a very clear hostility towards Judaism and certain elements in Judaism. We know about Jesus going into the temple, overturning the tables, and say this has become a den of thieves and it is no longer a house of worship and a place of God. He speaks about the Jews and their synagogues as if he himself was not a Jew. And then we have that prime example that's always on display in certain circles, where Pontius Pilate washes his hands and says, I don't want to have anything to do with this. You take Jesus and do what you want to do. and let his blood be on you. And then the whole people, as it is written in the Gospel in chapter 27, says, let his blood be on us and our children. And we know how that turned out, that piece of evidence against the Jewish people, the Christ killers. So what was going on here? Why this both affirming and then this hostility or this hostile attitude that we pick up in this gospel, the most Jewish of the gospels probably? What is going on here? I think it is very important to look at the context in which Judaism found itself in those days. And the most important date here is the year 70, that date that we ignore at our own peril for understanding our own religion and understanding Judaism, and especially the relationship between these two important religions in the world. In the year 70, the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed by the Romans after a Jewish rebellion, and which they actually succeeded in throwing and driving the Romans out of Jerusalem. It wasn't because they were so powerful or because God blessed their army or whatever. It was simply because the Romans had other fish to fry. They had a civil war that they first had to sort out in Italy and elsewhere. And when that was done and settled, they came back and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So Judaism was driven into an existential crisis. And what happened was, because the cultural center and the political center of Judaism was wiped off the map, they turned inward and closed ranks, because that is what societies and movements under threat do. Think for a moment if Washington would be wiped off the map. We had a little bit of, a disturbance, not the buildings destroyed, not severe loss of life, unfortunately, some loss of life when there was this insurrection in Washington on January the 6th. But think, perhaps to enable ourselves to imagine what Judaism was going through if the whole of Washington would be turned into rubble, and especially the capital. This was what happened to Judaism in the year 70. So they turned inward, and they did not have the will, or I think the energy, to consider anything new, like the teachings of Jesus, this new rabbi that acquired quite a following. So there was a rejection, and a growing one, between the establishment, the traditional Jewish approach, and the followers of Jesus, the Jesus movement. And there was also a growing hostility between the two groups, feeling threatened by the growing number of non-Jews, the Gentiles, becoming Jews. And there was a movement among the Jewish adherents to slowly come to the recognition or to the acceptance that this Jesus movement is also something that can and should be allowed to take root and to move into the Gentile, the non-Jewish community and societies. And this passage that we listen to, this Great Commission, where Jesus was on the mountain with his disciples, and as things go in the Gospel of Matthew, when there is an important event taking place or an announcement, normally takes place on a mountain, like the Sermon on the Mount. Again, here Jesus is on the mountain with his disciples, and he makes this correction according to the author. He says, this is not only good news and the gospel for the Jewish people. This good news is for everybody, for all the nations, and nations in that context had a more limited meaning, not so broad as we would say today, all the nations of the earth, but nations referring to the Gentiles. And forgetting this context, that it was about an intra-Jewish disagreement and hostility between two Jewish factions, following the destruction of the temple, and this recognition that this good news and the gospel of Jesus is also for non-Jewish people. If we forget that and we focus on finding the Jewish people as a whole guilty of killing Jesus, as the gospel says, if we decontextualize that, we know what the outcome is. We've just lit that candle to remember what the pinnacle is of demonizing the other, stirring and creating hatred against the other. It is still with us. Up till November last year, there were, according to the FBI report, 7,314 hate crime events that year, up to November. It's probably gone to get close to the year 2008, which was a bad year, where 7,800 plus hate crimes were committed, and the FBI identifies or classifies hate crimes as a crime that is results from prejudice against a group, race or religion or sexual orientation, and so forth. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the philosophy of replacement. And we heard the people marching in Charlotte, in South Carolina, saying the Jews will not replace us, etc. It comes from the philosophy of Jean Camus, not the Nobel Peace Prize winner for literature, a different one, who published a book about what he calls the replacement of Western civilization by people streaming in from everywhere else. And one gets the first hint of this in the fictional description, a novel published by Jean Raspail, The Camp of the Saints, which describes a camp in France where immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees congregate, and from where it creates this movement to take over and destroy France and Western society. Looking at this, I think it is important for us to be aware of the context of that anti-Semitism text that is always used to justify anti-Semitism from the Gospel of Matthew, and we also find similar trends and traits in the Gospel according to John. We should be aware of it. And we should be aware that that is not what Jesus preached and what the author of Matthew had Jesus to say. It is about an intra-Jewish disagreement and a competition really for territory to establish the credibility of different factions within the Jewish community in the time of Jesus and following the destruction of the temple. We should be aware of how easily it happens and how often it has been repeated in human history. And it happens normally incrementally. It doesn't happen out of the blue with one swoop or one sudden movement. It happens incrementally when hatred of the other or demonizing of the other or dehumanizing the other to become a thing or an object, when that is allowed to find space and a foothold among any people or group of people in the world. I think we need to be aware of that. And I think we can make that the road that we will travel on, perhaps untraveled for us before, with vigilance, to be proponents of an informed treatment of our Gospels and our sacred text around this theme, but also in general in society, to guard against it, not to be silent, to speak out. When I originally formulated the sermon title, Road Untraveled, I was thinking more about us after this Easter emerging from the darkness of the pandemic. And again, trying to be normal, to be human. Again, experiencing and doing things that will seem strange to many of us. When I think of the pandemic and I think of Easter last year, it is very difficult to recall specifics, except that I can say that fortunately over the last few months, and especially around this Easter, I have had no funerals, no burials. Last year, in the height of the pandemic, it was terrible, and it was terrible to experience those burials, the impersonal nature of it, everybody masked and everybody distanced, and doing it outside around the graveside. We will emerge as individuals, as families, as a church community, returning to normality. We will travel a road that we haven't traveled before. But I just want to introduce this as well today in a post-Easter environment. That we keep this in mind and perhaps make it our Easter commitment as well, as we travel this road that none of us have been on before. To do so as God's people, embracing the great commandment of love for God, practiced and illustrated by love for all life around us. My special Easter insight that was a huge reward to me was looking at this passage, this correction of the author of Matthew, where Jesus is now saying, no, this good news about Jesus should not be confined to Jews only, but also the Gentiles. this passage that wasn't one of my favorites before, because I'm not so much into converting people to accept my religion. I'm more into the living of the kingdom of the gospel, the great commandment instead of the great commission. But looking at this again, I realized, but this is not only about winning converts, as I think the church preferred to see it for its own purposes, within its own historical context of broader Western society and culture and civilization. It was also, if you read the passage carefully, you see, Jesus says, make them disciples. And what does it mean to be a disciple, especially in the time in which this text originated, this manuscript of the gospel according to Matthew? It was assumed, and it was the custom, that when you make somebody a disciple, or where somebody is a disciple, it is not only about the teachings, but it is about the literal following of the way of being in the world of a specific teacher. So Jesus says, be my disciples, follow in my way, and he tells his followers, teach them to obey everything that I have commanded you. So we get the great commandment back into this critical passage at the end of the Gospel according to Matthew. And for me, that was like the sun rising, this insight. But the so-called Great Commission and the Great Commandment, those are not in conflict. They convey the same message: to walk in the ways of Jesus, to follow his example with the way that we are in the world. And may that be how we travel this road forward, as individuals, as families, and as church community. Always walking on the road that brings life, that leads to life, that results in justice, and bring peace, that enables us to have hope and to bring hope. May God's Spirit lead us along that road. Amen.